Hi everyone, welcome to Infinite Women. I'm Allison, and I just wanted to share a talk that I gave last week at the conference for the Australian Women's History Network because, like any conference, there's multiple events going on at any given time, and so even people who were at the conference couldn't necessarily come to see my talk specifically. So today I wanted to talk about ownership and rejection when public figures can't live up to unrealistic standards. And I will share links to the podcast episodes that I'm referencing because that is where I get so much of my information. So, decades before the term cancel culture was coined, British writer Mary Ward had already been blackballed by feminist scholars. Ward was the author of the best-selling 1894 novel Marcella, which was part of the proto-feminist New Woman literary movement. Ward and her books were hugely influential, and Marcella arguably should be part of the feminist literary canon. However, because she served for a few years as the figurehead of an anti-suffrage league, when feminist scholars were reclaiming such works in the 1970s, they basically said, "Don't touch Mary Ward," as Dr. Josephine Brown told me. Juxtapose this with suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who publicly spouted racism to push for women's right to vote, or rather privileged women's. Both of them were actively opposing the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the first granting citizenship rights to formerly enslaved people, and the latter granting African American men the right to vote. But they weren't just racist, they were also classist. When poor women working in textile mills fought for better working conditions, both of these women actively encouraged other women to cross the picket lines. Then there's the eugenicists. Margaret Sanger, Marie Stopes, and other birth control advocates were often in this camp, as were the 5 women behind Canada's Persons case, who challenged whether women constituted persons under Canadian law. Over and over again, we see highly privileged women becoming icons, both contemporaneously and historically. And I say icons very deliberately here. They are symbols, often stripped of the complexities that make people real, that make us human. So, am I saying we should cancel these problematic icons? No, obviously not. What is needed is nuance and context, understanding why these women held troubling beliefs and how those shaped their actions and their activism, and in turn impacted communities and entire societies. The birth control pill was tested on poor women of color in Puerto Rico and Mexico who were not properly informed of the risks. That is an important part of this history. Native American, Asian American, Latinx, and African American suffragists had to fight for their own enfranchisement long after the 19th Amendment was ratified. And yet, these are the aspects that often get minimized, glossed over, or left out entirely when we tell these stories, because that nuance makes people uncomfortable, and so it gets sanitized. So, why didn't Mary Ward get sanitized? Why did she get canceled? In my opinion, because the people making that decision were likely also privileged feminists, typically white and typically from financially well-off family backgrounds. They could accept classism and racism, but not what they presumably saw as a betrayal of the sisterhood. They viewed this as a personal attack in ways that negative actions impacting marginalized groups were not something they necessarily empathized with. And I'll get more into the psychological factors that I see playing into this later, but first I want to expand on how this behavior is not unique, but rather seems to be universal. So going beyond feminism, this sense of ownership and rejection of any in-group member who does not live up to individuals or groups' arbitrary standards, while allowing seemingly much worse offenses from others, expands across different marginalized groups. So looking at how this plays out within racialized communities, I'd like to tell you a tale of 2 Asian film stars from the golden age of Hollywood, Merle Oberon and Anna May Wong. There's an interesting juxtaposition here because Wang, the American-born daughter of Chinese immigrants, was typecast for much of her career in stereotypical roles. Meanwhile, Oberon, the first woman of Asian descent to be nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, passed as Caucasian throughout her career. And both have been the target of vitriol from their respective communities. So let's start with Anna May Wong. She started acting as a teenager, and she was very exoticized, often very sexualized, and most of her early roles were bundles of negative stereotypes about Asian women. This led to criticisms from Asian and Asian diaspora communities, who blamed Wong for depicting them in a bad light. The same people would often commend white actors like the Swedish Warner Oland, who portrayed Asians in positive ways, but were doing so in yellowface, still often playing into stereotypes and taking roles away from actual people of Asian descent. Not least because anti-miscegenation rules meant that if you had a white actor in yellowface, any love interest that they had also had to be played by another white actor in yellowface. This criticism toward Wong is also clearly misplaced, as the typically white, typically male gatekeepers, such as writers, directors, producers, and studio executives, were the ones responsible for these characters. And the simple fact is that if Wong had not taken those roles, they simply would have found another young woman of Asian descent, or even another BIPOC woman, as Puerto Rican actress Rita Moreno famously played a variety of ethnicities, including the Thai woman Tuptim in The King and I. Today's version is whitewashing Asian characters by casting Caucasian or other non-Asian actors as characters who were meant to be Asian based on source material or other clues, such as Tilda Swinton in Doctor Strange, Scarlett Johansson in Ghost in the Shell, Emma Stone in Aloha, which she has said she regretted, so we'll give her a point for that. And not one, but two characters in the Matt Damon film The Martian. Similar to Wong, Hattie McDaniel, the first African-American actor to win an Oscar for her performance in Gone with the Wind, faced criticisms from the African-American community because she routinely played maids and variations on a maid, and she basically said that she'd rather play a maid than be one. So, apart from the fact that these women were literally the face of these negative stereotypes being played out across the country and internationally on screen, it does seem clear to me that these communities found it safer to attack members of their own community, particularly women, rather than call out the decision makers who were truly responsible for perpetuating and promoting these stereotypes, which, again, we'll dig more into that in a minute. But first I want to contrast Anna May Wong and Hattie McDaniel's situation with Merle Oberon. She was the product of a white British man raping his teenage stepdaughter and then abandoning the family. Oberon spent her entire life believing that her biological mother was her sister and her biological grandmother was her mother. The women were of Sri Lankan descent, living in India, and Oberon emigrated to the UK as a young woman and began working in British cinema in the 1930s, playing roles such as Anne Boleyn and later Kathy from Wuthering Heights. As we can see from Wong's story, such roles would never have been available to her if she were not passing as white. Even today, actors of color often struggle to be cast in interesting, complex roles. Studio executives falsified her backstory as a young woman who'd been born to European parents in Tasmania. And that remained her public origin story for the rest of her life. It wasn't just a character that was whitewashed, it was her actual identity. Now, ironically, in 1934, she was in a film called The Battle, in which she played a Japanese woman, and she did perform in yellowface, but that's a whole other rabbit hole. But because she was pushed by powerful men and the power structures that they upheld into disavowing half of her heritage, many people today dismiss her place in history. Her name came up in recent years when Michelle Yeoh was nominated for the Best Actress Oscar, and while she was quick to point out that she was not the first, many people relegated Oberon to a footnote or an asterisk that seemingly implied, does she even count? These individuals want to erase her history in response to others having erased her history when she was alive. And it's also worth noting that Boris Karloff, who was also Anglo-Indian and did the exact same thing, doesn't seem to have faced any such backlash in his legacy. And he chose that path for himself rather than having it pushed on him by studio executives. Now, if you'd like to know more about either woman, you can listen to the podcast episodes that I did about them, or read the biographies written by the people that I talked to. So we've got Not Your China Doll by Katie G. Salisbury for Wong and Love Queenie by Ma Yuk-sen. I really enjoyed both books and both conversations. Now, switching focus from a disability standpoint, as just one example, there are members of the deaf community who are deeply opposed to cochlear implants, which on an individual level may be rooted in what they see as a rejection of the deaf community. And it is a very common and natural response to react to what you see as a rejection of yourself and your community for you to say, I reject you instead. And that obviously gets played out on a much more individual and personal level that I can't really speak to. There are much larger conversations around the medical versus social models of disability. The difference being that medical sees disability as a problem that needs to be fixed, and the other sees society's refusal to accommodate different needs as the main factor disabling people. Now, as someone with ADHD and autism, I don't see my neurodivergence as something that needs to be fixed, but I can also appreciate that other neurodivergent people's lives are made easier or enriched by using interventions that I choose not to. Now, I'd also like to touch on how we see this dynamic playing out in queer spaces. And I'm particularly referencing June Thomas's A Place of Our Own, 6 Spaces That Shaped Queer Women's Culture, with this story of a lesbian bar called Pearl Diver. Now, it was owned and operated by lesbians, and they showed up to work one day and a sticker had been plastered across the door proclaiming, "This bar exploits women." Yes, the bar charged more than a general audience bar down the street, but that's because it was a new business, still paying off equipment and other startup expenses. They also catered to an obviously much smaller audience, and fewer people mean that it's going to be more expensive per person. June also told me, recounting what the bar owner said at the time of the cheaper bar, "You only pay 50 cents for a beer instead of 75 cents that we charge, but they don't treat you well in any other way." But they didn't expect them to. But they had really high expectations for the women's bar. The same latitude also applied to lesbian and other queer bars owned by people outside the queer community. It was only when the owners were members of the community that their fellow community members held them to these higher and often unreasonable and unrealistic standards. So what's going on here? First and foremost, it can feel safer to punch sideways or punch down rather than A, focus on the people in power who are the real source of the problem, or B, actually try to address the problem. If you're not familiar, punching up and down is a term used in comedy regarding privilege. So if, as a woman with autism, I make a joke about neurotypicals being weird, that's punching up, because I'm making a joke at the expense of those with privilege that I don't have. If I make a racist joke as a white woman, that's obviously punching down. Punching sideways is more so steeped in internalized bigotries, like when women play into misogynistic stereotypes, or it could also refer to lateral violence, like a person from one racialized group making a joke at the expense of people of a different marginalized racialized group. So basically, you're less likely to face serious consequences by attacking the people with less power. And that's usually true regardless of the context. But those internalized biases that I mentioned, and possibly even self-hatred, can also play into this. The idea that you're making us look bad brings respectability politics into play, where you may be holding members of the community to higher standards because marginalized groups know that one of their members will often be portrayed as representing everyone, as we saw in the cases of Anna May Wong and Hattie McDaniel. There's also the feeling of ownership, for better or worse. By saying, we claim you, many people also believe there is a corollary that we have a say in how you act. And I want to come back to something that I mentioned earlier with Mary Ward, that this feels personal, and that can lead to a lack of empathy and critical consideration, because we are showing an instinctive response to feeling hurt and betrayed. How could you do this to us when you're meant to be one of us? That's not to say that there aren't fair and reasonable criticisms, particularly of the more powerful member of a community, like calling out Caitlyn Jenner for using her fame and money to support and promote transphobia despite being a trans woman. It's all about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how it is used. Now, when we look at the consequences, humans are flawed, but hiding those flaws or excluding people entirely gives us a less complete picture of history. And I don't think I need to tell anyone why that's a bad thing. But criticizing our contemporaries can also have a chilling effect on speech and activism. People who are afraid they'll be attacked if they get something wrong are less likely to try in the first place. It can drive people away from movements for things that might have been done out of ignorance instead of malice, or were simply completely misconstrued by people who then piled on. Lindsay Ellis, a popular YouTuber, disappeared from the public eye for years when she was accused of making a racist comment because she said the film Raya and the Last Dragon seemed derivative of the series Avatar: The Last Airbender. People who would rather be critical than think critically assumed that this white woman was calling all media centering Asian characters and cultures the same, when not only was her comment accurate, it was also a sentiment that other people were also stating at the time. And for my part, I had people calling me out on Blue Sky several months back because they didn't like how a biography of a Native American woman, Zitkala Sa, phrased her childhood experience of being lured to a residential school where, like countless Indigenous children, she was mistreated, which the biography explicitly states, both the abuse and the fact that this was part of that larger pattern. I think it's important to recognize that many of those children and their parents were persuaded that this was a good thing, rather than those children being taken by physical force. But certain folks on the internet think that saying anything other than that these children were taken, kidnapped, stolen, etc. makes you a colonialist racist, instead of someone trying to provide accuracy and nuance. For one thing, I think it's important to recognize the more insidious and harmful, subtle methods that are used in oppression, because they continue to be used today. But I also particularly disliked that these people were disregarding Zitkala Sa's own words and trying to rewrite her story to fit their own narrative. I was quoting her autobiography, where she recounts begging her mom to let her go, and I literally had someone accuse me of being the kind of person who blames child victims of sexual assault for being victimized. All of this is to say that this kind of behavior resulted in me taking down the post because I was tired of the harassment, and it did make me hesitate the next time I was going to post something that might potentially trigger that kind of response. And just because these people may be Indigenous, emphasis on may, it is the internet, and these are rando strangers. But even if they are Indigenous, that didn't give them the right to try to rewrite Zitkala Sa's own story to suit their desires. And by attacking me for what they saw as imperfect allyship, all they did was potentially make me less likely to share Indigenous stories in the future. Now, I have continued to do so, but that initial hesitancy was a direct result of just not wanting to be harassed online for nothing more than sharing a Native American woman's story the way that she herself told it. And the end result of that would have been less awareness of her story. Because I and people like me who may have experienced the same thing don't want that experience. But also, I didn't want people to associate those kind of comments with her story. I didn't want to sully it for anyone who might be coming across this thread, and that's their introduction to this person who was really amazing. Please do go read her story. But what all this comes down to is that there is a difference between fair and reasonable criticism, which should always be allowed and is often vital to an individual's growth, versus baseless attacks whose only purpose is to make the attacker feel righteous. The key when we're talking about how, and in response to what behaviors we call people out for, is fair and reasonable, which unfortunately we all know people have a tendency not to be.